Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have the pleasure of speaking to the one and only Holly and Pae, and I am delighted to have this opportunity because they have spearheaded and brought forth to the internet a wonderful anthology, and it is a pleasure. Michelle and I had the honor of being part of it, the Stygian collection, and they have Stygian Press. There it is, bam. And I really, I had the pleasure, Michelle and I had the pleasure of speaking with them the other night. And I would like to kind of just echo the sentiment of how important I think these kind of projects are for this new emerging online space. BookTube is a fascinating place. I would suggest, obviously your channels both just have so many resources that so many young writers or people who are older writing, who have been writing for years, can benefit from. That having that available and knowing that's available is actually extremely encouraging and extremely useful and can help you figure out how to plow ahead and to move ahead. And to also know there are other people doing that work is also encouraging. But that would require you to make the videos and post them. So thank you for doing that. And in addition to that, to know that there are efforts, say, by BookTube and the entire liminal web space, which is a category term for all of the different kind of YouTube communities that you'll hear, for those communities to be doing and putting together an anthology like this is also very encouraging, because it means there's a way to get your work published that's in a community of like-minded people who also care about this sort of work that can be difficult to find a place in this world where people care about those sort of things. But that would require people to assemble, edit, market, and to put the book together. And that would be where you, Holly, and Pae have done that. And thank you for doing that. Thank you for the opportunity. And I'm so glad to have this opportunity to speak with you. So to start, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having us. and we're so glad to have you and Michelle involved in the book. I think it wouldn't be quite what it is without you both.
Well, that's very kind of you, Holly. Well, the first question I'll ask you both is, what inspired you to do this collection? Why did you think it was needed? Why did you feel the passion to go about doing this project? And what gave you the idea? What was the first sort of, inkling about doing this project in general?
I remember the first conversation we had when we first started discussing this. It was largely due in part with something we actually touched on. It might have been after we were done filming on the last conversation with Michelle. We touched on it a bit in that conversation. I don't remember if it was during the filming or not, but and that was kind of this idea of meeting certain expectations. Not, I should say meeting expectations, but the meeting requirements would be that every single publisher at this time, I'm still presumably still is, dealing with more than often certain political issues or something, and you could not get anything published. No one would accept it unless it had these checked off, like a whole list. And I think that was just getting too much. Not as what was mentioned before, not that there's anything wrong writing about those things that they want you to check off. It's that there's something I find
limiting
things, in enforcing it, and this idea of art for art's sake, which was mentioned as well, was kind of the principal ground that we were setting off on. And so I've been thinking on starting something that got away more back to the basics for a while, but it was always just a kind of a thought. It was never anything that I was never really serious. I was like, well, I'll keep trying and sending off manuscript after manuscript, and eventually, but as you mentioned last conversation, that takes a lot of time, because when you send one off, you can't send one to anyone else, and oftentimes it takes, sometimes you'll read that says, oh, well, we will respond within 3 months, and then you wait 3 months and then nothing, and then you think, okay, can I send this? So then I would start sending it, but then a year later I'd get a response back and say, well that was a bit longer than expected. So it was just but so it was just kind of a thought I had. And then I guess one day Holly and I were talking when I was still back in Calgary, and she mentioned
Bloomsbury?
Virginia Bloomsbury group and wanting to do something like that. And I thought that, I was like, well, that sounds like, you know, what I've been thinking. And that kind of went from there. Holly thought of the name Stygian. And I was like, yeah, sounds cool to me. Okay, let's go with that. And so that was that. And then yeah, and of course the editor Pamela is Holly's mom. So that worked very well. And yeah, I guess.
And the anthology concept was yours.
Yeah. Yeah, originally I had suggested we do two, one of the fiction and then one nonfiction, but it didn't. But I think what we did turned out much better because I think I wasn't aware of how much work goes into. I mean, of course, I've written and published before, but this was very different. This was dealing with however many authors we have in this collection,
24,
and yeah,
like 24.
and so it was, so I wasn't really I oversaid, so I think it was preferable to do what we had done here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, it definitely, this particular, you know, project started because Pae and I would just sort of, I mean, we were both posting videos on YouTube, and that's how we met. And we would sort of express positive things, negative things. We would express some frustrations about the industry. And I think also, I'll say, I think that the conversation that we had on the Stygian, that'll be on the Stygian channel, might come out after this one. So just to say, what we were sort of summing up was this concept that your identity as an author matters more than your story. And we wanted to bring back something that focused on the story and the talent rather than your identity. Not to vilify any identities. Like, we're a very inclusive publisher, but at the same time, like, it's about the writing, it's about the talent, it's about the art. And I think that is a little bit of it's getting lost in some traditional publishers these days. So we wanted to create a space for that. And also, like, I personally was making videos that educated people on, like, here's how you edit, here's how you do your story, here's how you self-publish. But the thing is, like, that's not for everyone. And there still needs to be that sort of space that bridges the gap where, like, okay, maybe you're not up for self-publishing, and maybe you don't have the energy to go after a traditional publisher. And here we are, we're helping you, but not in a hybrid way. Like, it is closer to traditional while still being small and community driven.
Wonderful answers from you both. And I can speak to Michelle and I having our own experience in sending off so many different letters, and you're trying to keep out 100 at all times in the submittable and different things. And they say 6 months, and then a year later, and you get you can only submit to one, and you're kind of on this wheel that's turning. And then it turns out, no, you actually never had a chance because it wasn't within the boundaries of those themes that they didn't tell you that they were even doing until you get in. And again, like you say, there's no problem with any of those things, but the question becomes, what is the order? Does the art become before the theme, or does the theme become before the art? And what that ends up doing is creating a situation where, hey, even people like that follow those identities that publications are looking for, they may themselves not want to write in a manner that showcases or forces the work to be about those identities. I think of Percival Everett. He just, I think, won the Booker Prize for his wonderful text, The Trees. He writes that wonderful book, Eraser, where he talks about an African-American who just wants to write a story on Greek mythology. And no, you can't do that. It needs to be about your identity. And so it's all good intention, of course, but then the question becomes, are there things that can be left out for that? And I think that's a conversation that has to be had in the publishing world. Also, I think what's so lovely that you now have with, say, I would say, I know obviously the internet's been around for a long time, but for more and more people to have access to high speed or faster internet, realistically able to use Zoom, this say maybe as of 2015, I'm just throwing out a random number, this does seem to make possible a world of, I know a hot word now is decentralization. It does seem to make possible a decentralized world of publication and art thinking, where you could have many Bloomsbury group where maybe in the past only if you happen to teach at Cambridge or something would you have access to the homes of the Virginian, the Wolves, or different things. But now you can do it here, and sometimes it almost feels like YouTube. It almost is like a Bloom's Tube or almost like a show and tell opportunity, where it's not just consumption, but it's a way to sort of form these communities. But the next step for that would be to say publish things. And I think the anthology model is a great way to get people, because the lovely thing about that is everyone who's in the anthology now has a connection. If they didn't know, there's like some sort of story they're all part of, that they are like, oh, we're all in that anthology together. I never met you before, I didn't know you, but now we're part of something together. And the more and more that is done, and the more people kind of feel connected that way, the more and more the people will feel stronger in these sort of efforts, because these efforts can feel lonely and they can feel difficult and they can feel outside the box. But the more it's done, the more people can be encouraged in them. So I think Michelle and I can speak to some of the experiences that you had and in appreciation of those alternative opportunities. And then, of course, the other thing that it does is you have people reading your work. It's amazing how difficult it can be to find people to read your work, and to have a place where people are willing to do that is such a big deal. Why on the Stygian website it is mentioned, say, looking for philosophical themes? Now that catches my eye because Michelle and I, there are some. You do have like Rediver, you have the Azura Submission magazine, I believe is what it is, but most publications don't want anything to do with philosophy, basically, or even ideas. Like if they sense ideas in your story, they throw up a little in their mouth and then swallow it back down. What were some of the why do you think ideas, and this is a broad question, why do you think ideas matter for stories? Do they matter for stories? Philosophy in general? I know Pae and I talk about philosophy all the time, and it doesn't have to be philosophy as such. It can just be ideas. Why is there a need to say specifically that is welcome? And what is the value that can be added by bringing attention to incorporating that into literature?
So for me, like there was this interesting thing where when Pae and I were first collaborating, it was like, okay, we both have similar things that we're doing. We're both writers, but we're in very different spaces. Like currently I'm in more of a young adult, and like my channel educates, younger writers. That's sort of the thing, like teenagers and that sort of area. I have that a bit of YA, but I hesitate to use that term because I don't like what YA has become. I'm more like, classic YA, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah.
But I was in that realm, and Pae is in this more like philosophical adult realm, exploring very different thing. We were like, well, we want to do readings together. We want to do this, collaborative stuff. How are we going to do that? And we wanted to find things that we had in common. And that was actually where Stygian came from, that it was this, that one of the things that we both do is explore darker regions and things that make you think, or I hope we do at least. And so when we were creating this, it was like, I want a space for my stuff and also Pae's stuff. So how are we going to have a space that's for both of us? And that and that was a major thing that we were exploring. So philosophy was very important, but also for me, I think that with Bloomsbury, one of the most important things that they were doing, and I've started delving into it deeper because I will have to give my mom full credit. She inspired me in that area. She welcomed me into that. Both of my parents are writers and artists, so they like raised me with that, and I was interested in. And I've been delving deeper on my own now. But a huge thing in Bloomsbury was not just that they were, writing and publishing, they had philosophers in there. And that was deeply important in creating what they stood for and fostering things in their writing. So I think that it is very important to include philosophy and exploration of thought. If you are going to have writing, they go hand in hand extremely well.
That's a wonderful answer, and I'll give it to Pae. The first thing that just comes to mind, I think it should absolutely be noted when you look at all these different communities. And a book I always reference on this is Randall Collins' Theory of Intellectual Change. When you look at all these different communities, whether it be the Scottish Enlightenment, Bloomsburg will focus on that, you see this mixture of the interdisciplinary, the economist Keynes, the novelist Woolf, the philosopher, all these different people. And I think it's a secret of how creativity works. Like, it's actually in the mixture of ideas that things come to the forefront that otherwise would not come to the forefront. And it's like, you need to have an encounter. I find basically, like, when it comes to literature or story writing, you need to have a philosophy in your head or ideas that you leave behind in the story, but that come out in the story, and the story being a story, because there's something about that kind of annihilation or negating in a Hegelian sense, or annihilating that Heidegger talks about, that changes the quality, because you had those ideas in your head that you could then storify, and otherwise you lose something there, or it can be more difficult to think of what to do, or you don't have that kind of depth in operation. So that interdisciplinary character, that cross-pollination, I think is very, very important that you're bringing out.
Yeah. I mean, one thing to say is it would be very, and I'm just taking a very death of the author approach. It would be very difficult to have literature without say being completely absent of ideas. The ideas more than often come from the reader, not necessarily the author, whether they were intended or not. But the importance of it would largely do in part of history. I think the act of storytelling, the reasons on why we do it, to tell histories embodied more than often in fiction, and they're not, when we say, we seem to equate the term fiction with false or untrue, which is completely inaccurate. I mean, that's just not what fiction is. It's interpretation, if anything. But so I think a large part of this, the importance of keeping I mean, I know, at least for me, I find it very difficult to write any work of fiction without first understanding the philosophical background in which this world, I guess, takes place. And I know you were saying something about your own fiction when writing it. Belonging Again, for example, came from a novel you had written. I don't know if that's okay to say here. I don't know if that's under wraps or whatnot. But so I know for me, they very much go hand in hand in such a way. And you could tell when this happens as well. I mean, more than often, when you read a novel, what you're reading is a very, very small part of what was actually written. It's whether that deals with research or writing a whole entire philosophical work around it. Studying philosophy itself, like that is primarily, it's really all I read these days, and it's actually even most of what I write. I don't publish it, but it is, and for similar reasons. I'm writing well, I'm finished. I'm going back to edit a science fiction novel, actually, but the whole entire underlying philosophy of that is very Hegelian, and it's kind of this dialectic. Well, I won't get into it here, but it's which is something I didn't even realize I incorporated in until I spoke to a very close friend of mine who's very well versed in this, and as I was explaining to him, he's like, oh, okay, so I take it you're studying Hegel now, and well, I think. But I didn't even really mean to do that. It's just something that kind of ends up in the writing process itself, just because, and whether people realize it or not, people end up connecting with that more, because the philosophy is usually something very shared And so when you have that in your fiction, it's going to connect with a lot more people than if you're doing some weird thing in which you're trying to purposely leave it out.
I was gonna say, yeah, and I think just to wrap it up in terms of like specifically mentioning we're interested in philosophical works, I think that there is not a lot of space that like clearly welcomes that, especially in the like, I don't know, traditional publishing. Just what I've seen, you see it in a lot of academic areas, but not like publishers who are going for fiction and stuff like that. So we definitely wanted to say like this is a space for these things. We want to talk about stuff.
I think, well, that's certainly something that attracted me and Michelle, because I think it's absolutely the case that traditional publishing is allergic to anything they think is philosophical. Which, of course, I think if you, like we were saying at the beginning, the importance of, like, for a lot of these publishers emphasizing identity or things like that, well, I would argue some of the ways that you can actually deal with and think through the problems of identity requires philosophy. And so if you're allergic to that, well, then some of these very things that you're concerned about, you may be removing something that you need to really fully express that and to deal with that. So much of identity, like so much pain that's caused between people, for example, is a result of misunderstanding. You know, Chekhov has that wonderful line where he says, the thing that you have to understand about people who love one another is that they're constantly misunderstanding one another. Like, you know, you go through Chekhov and all the loved ones ever do is they never understand what the other person is saying. And very often, like in relationships, for example, if you have two people that care about one another, you would assume they wouldn't hurt one another. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to this, but generally speaking, a lot of people who hurt one another don't mean to hurt one another. They thought they were being nice. They thought that was an understanding of love. And then but then the problem is, if the other person interprets that as hate, but the other person interprets it as love, when they're told that's hateful to me, then they're really hurt. Or then the person who's loving is like, oh, you're upset right now? Well, I need to love you more. And then it's like making it worse and worse and worse and worse. And all of that would describe a kind of hermeneutical enclosure that people get in, that they can't escape, that ideas can help you work through. I mean, ideas are lenses. Ideas can save your life, and ideas can save you from falling into some of the hermeneutical problems or mistake that arises between identity that can be very useful. And so if you don't allow that within stories, you can really be losing a resource that's very important. And the other thing it makes me think of is when you mention fiction and people think that's false. I think it was C.S. Lewis who had this idea where he's like, I really want to talk about a supposing. Like, let's not call it fiction. Let's call it a supposing. Let's suppose there was a line. Let's suppose. And it's like, and it's funny because when you say it that way, then it's really philosophical. Well, let's suppose that the soul and the mind with it. Let's suppose that, you know, you had to choose between saving the world and committing a crime. It's like, there's something about when you frame fiction as a supposing, let us suppose there was a world that was X, Y, and Z. Let us suppose. You can almost see in that how ideas are in the background, because fiction begins with a supposing. Let us suppose there were people who lived here. Let us suppose there were three brothers with Karamazov as a last name. And I always liked what Lewis said on the supposing, because I think that's often what fiction is a kind of supposing. And you can certainly mention To Turn the World. Yeah, like you write belonging again, this fiction, this philosophy text with the fiction of belonging again, with Turn the World, and that those are actually informing one another and that they're alive there in that way. So no, I would certainly say the welcoming of philosophy into literature is very, very important. And then also I would frankly say that I think a lot of people who read literature, there's a lot of people that go to read novels precisely because they actually are more philosophically inclined. There are certain philosophical quandaries or situations that can be expressed in literature that I don't think can be expressed in any other art form as well.
I was just going to say before we continue a bit,
Please.
just before I lose it, I think that we are losing a lot of discussion in fiction right now. And I think that by bringing philosophy into that realm, we try to bring it back, and that does sort of reflect on that identity thing, that there needs to be more conversation, like healthy conversation, healthy debate, open exploration. And I think that that's always been one of the best things that art and literature does. And to do that, to lose that is a huge loss. So if there's any sort of movement to bring that back, I would hope we can be a part of that.
I'll give it to Pae to speak. But I just wanted to say on that, I think that puts it very well. I think one of the most fun and important parts of literature is the discussion, and philosophy really feeds that, and you lose the ability to discuss literature if you don't have that philosophy. You know, if I say to you, hey, I mentioned the Brothers Karamazov because I think every discussion on literature has to do it once. There's like a quota, right? So Hamlet, Brothers Karamazov, like, hey, each one of these brothers represents one possible way the modern world could be for Dostoevsky. One of them is the intellectual of Ivan Karamazov that doesn't have any that has no axiomatic grounding for that new world. The other is Dmitri, the sensualist, looking for just the experience or the emotion. And the last is a return to Orthodox religion. And Dostoevsky is telling you that the modern world will look like one of those three. The question is the following: has that proven true? Is that true? In what ways was Dostoevsky wrong? In what ways was Dostoevsky right? And you also note that the biggest scoundrel of the novel is the father. So Dostoevsky is not saying, let's go back to the past. He's like, nah, the past was a scoundrel. It wasn't very good. But what should the world, so this isn't a nostalgic thing, but what should the world look like? And when you say that in a classroom, you've left it open where we can discuss the novel. We can go into great detail on the novel, but also we can go into bigger questions that could get into the world today and your own personal experience in life. And then you can come back to the text. And I know Sam at Greenerside is talking about, well, now it's like relevant to you. The Brothers Karamazov is relevant to you. Now you care about it. And the moment you can get people to go, I care about this and this is relevant to my life, well, now you've opened the entire horizon of literature. And so if you don't have that philosophical dimension, it's very likely you're not going to have the discussion. And if you don't have the discussion, it's much less likely that you're going to have people see how these novels and works relate. And if they don't relate to them, well, then who cares? They're not going to care. They're not going to spend their time in that way.
Yeah, no, going to there's certain things in which fiction can speak about, in which philosophy finds it very difficult. I think there's a very good reason why so many existential philosophers tend to also write fiction. There's certain ontological angles that can't be put down in such analytical measures. Oh, you read something. You talk about the Brothers Karamazov, and having this kind of there's no axology to found say one's ethics or something. Whereas, like, say, science fiction is, you look at a lot of the heroes in science fiction novels, that's just deontology gone amok. I mean, and so you can express, you take these kind of things and show, well, here's what happens when under such circumstances, which are always a possibility, and especially in something like Brothers Karamazov, where it's not just a possibility, but I mean, you get this all the time, and people deal with these issues all the time. So it's yeah, no, I think no, like I said, I guess just going back to the point, I think there's a very good reason why post-war existentialists a lot of them were writing novels as well, and many looking up to Dostoevsky and people like Kafka as being pivotal in their own work.
It's a wonderful answer, and I think one of the great problems of philosophy, first off, it makes my heart so happy to hear axology and deontology. You know, it just makes me so happy to hear those terms. So thank you. You know, there's been always this problem of disembodiment, lack of the concrete in philosophy, and there's something about storytelling that actually it helps a story be in-storied, like embodied. And the existentialist, like, it's almost like I always kind of think about story as a kind of test of a philosophy. Like, if you can't make a story out of the philosophy, then there's a good chance to think it's not true, or that there's something missing to it. Like, the ability to story a philosophy functions as a kind of test to it in a way, and it also makes it more relatable. And it also says, oh, wait a minute, I was feeling that. I feel anxiety too and nausea when I look at a tree. Oh, wait, maybe philosophy is relevant. And then suddenly you're like, oh, well, let's put it this way. I actually think it kind of works, and I'll be curious what you think of this, but no pressure to respond except all the pressure in the world, is that I feel like philosophy creates the dialogue of literature, but literature can actually create dialogue and philosophy. Like, both of them have a way of making you realize the relevance of the other. And there's almost and then you start discussing literature with philosophy, in the same way that like having literature can help you to discuss philosophy. And it's almost like both of them have a way of making you realize the importance of the other, and they kind of lubricate one another to also help dialogue. So it's all, so to me, like separating them really hurts both in some really deep ways. Because then, like, when philosophers try to talk who have no training in story or no metaphor ability, they're very hard to understand. They're using abstract terms. And then Hegel, you mentioned Hegel. And I wanted to mention before I forgot, I have this image. You know how Borges has the story of the guy rewriting Don Quixote on accident? I have this image of Pae rewriting the Phenomenology of Spirit and looking up, and he'd be like, "Oh, I didn't know it's Hegel." So you know, my bad. I didn't mean to redo that. That would be great, actually. But it's interesting because it's like the other thing that literature does is like philosophers without it, they get lost in abstraction. And for Hegel, what can happen when you're lost in abstraction, that actually greatly, some people may think this is ironic because they're like, what are you talking about? Isn't Hegel like the most abstract philosopher ever? Yes, they're in his right. There is some argument for that. But ultimately for him, the keeping it in the abstract actually greatly lowers the ability of it being true. So this is the other kind of irony. I think sometimes people, like philosophers, want to keep story and literature and art out of philosophy because they think that lowers the probability of it being true. It's actually the opposite. The involvement probably increases the likelihood that it has something to do with reality, in the same way that including philosophy and literature probably increases the likelihood that it will inspire dialogue and get people interested in different things. So there's these kind of ironies where we've like removed them thinking it will be to the benefit of both, when actually it's kind of hurt them. No, but you know, the other thing I'd just add lastly is that like saving literary dialogue or conversation, you know, it's hard to say this though, because the first thing is like, oh, it's intellectual conversation or it's deep conversation. There's something about that then that makes it sound like pretentious and arrogant and self-congratulatory. It's almost gatekeeping. There's a kind of conversation, I almost want to say interested, like you're a conversation you kind of get lost in, or it feels like it's something bigger than you. It's not like a deep conversation. It's like it's getting at something bigger. And that quality of conversation, that kind of conversation, which I will note, in fact, I don't think happens very often in the college classroom. That's why I don't really want to associate it with the college classroom. I mean, I'm not saying every college classroom, but it's not necessarily the college classroom. You know, a lot of people may think that, but it's not. It's this different kind of conversation. Which I guess you could say some of these things you see on YouTube is trying to do. People talk about circling dialogos, all the talks that we have. Like, I would hope it would, I think they're getting at this quality of conversation. This quality of conversation that seems to be something that is possible due to literary and philosophical training. It does make me think, and I've been going back to it a lot over the last few months because Michelle and I are doing as we mentioned, the Parallax course on Ivan Illich, and he talks about conviviality, and basically he's asking, how do we get back to friendship? Because we don't have friends anymore. Friendship is dead. And at the end of The Closing of the American Mind by Alan Bloom, he mentions this idea that he says basically the following, which is pretty scandalous, but it's provocative, and I think actually there's truth to it. He says, the death of the humanities, because he's talking about academic, like the humanities are dying on college. Even in literary classrooms, it's actually dead. He's saying the death of the humanities will be the death of friendship, because humanities is the space in which friendship is possible. And he makes a distinction between, he's not talking spouse, marriage, or work associate. He's like, I'm talking friendship. And he's like, actually, if you lose the humanities, you even lose the capacity to know what a friend is from an associate. Now, I'm not ready to say that that's 100% true, but there's something provocative, and there's something about it that seems true. Like there's something about the you know, like the humanities, these things that people will be like, oh, it won't get you a job, right? Everyone's like, oh, it won't get you a job. Those things that don't get you a job are the things necessary for friendship. And if you put it that way, then it's what's necessary for community and society, as opposed to just commuting to work or something. Like everything's just like a road to get you to your job, but like community seems to have something tied to the humanities. I'd be curious what y'all think of that. It's something that I've been going around in my head quite a bit.
Well, when you said about, oh, you know, like this conversation doesn't necessarily happen in a, you know, university, like an academic space, the thing is, I think it used to. So I I think that is the difference. And when I personally went into university, I went in sort of expecting that sort of thing, and that's not what happened at all. So personally, I wound up going, okay, well, I like being in fine arts. I like learning this stuff, but I'm not really getting anything out of it other than, things that I could do on my own. Like I could do this through YouTube or through, like community classes, stuff like that, or, just figure it out on my own. And I don't need to be paying like the level that I'm paying to do this. And so there's been this thing removed that gave you that extra, like that made it worth it, which was that, brotherhood, sisterhood, I mean, we don't have to gender it, but like that community, that, that conversation, that debate, the exchange of knowledge, the excitement of sharing things, even if you disagreed about them. And I think that's the saddest thing that we're losing in our society right now.
I think that's very, very well put. The great, wonderful individual I've had the pleasure of speaking with before, Mr. Joshua Hansen, has released a new book recently, years in the making. I've received my copy. I'm looking forward to read his work. It's a Tractus Academias, I believe. It's in Latin, and I'm a country boy, and these things are hard to say. But it's about the academic environment and the changing of the college system. And we had the pleasure of reading Julian Benda together, The Treason of the Intellectual, et cetera, so forth. And he was warning back in the 20s, where he was basically saying, hey, the academic place creates the possibility of the spaces of those kind of conversations and brotherhood and community. And if it doesn't do that, it won't exist in the society. And then the question will be, what is the difference? What makes the society a community? And I think one of the things I am hopeful of is actually there's two things that can occur with this growing YouTube movement, if the liminal web, I'll just call it booktube, etc. Either the liminal web will replace the college system because it's failing, or it will force the college system to reform. Like that actually can be one of the beneficial things with competition, right? Like, if there's a value to competition, it's where universities have to look over and go, oh, we need to be able to provide that quality of conversation because we're not, and we're losing people. They're moving away from it. And
you're seeing some new universities form with that too. Yeah. Like, oh, bring it back.
Oh yeah, because I agree completely with you. Like, if you can get online and you can listen to the world expert on Heidegger on YouTube for free when you're available, why wouldn't you do that? And then it's like, and people are like, oh, and if you go to college for philosophy, you're not going to get a job. You're like, great, I won't go to philosophy for that. I won't go to college for that and save myself a ton of money. And so it is interesting that might be occurring, and I wonder if it will be a corrective and kind of call a reformation. I certainly think it would be another topic, but I was speaking with the great layman Pascal about it, and I've mentioned it with Michelle Future. I do think that if the college monopoly on credentials breaks down, which is not a technical monopoly, but basically you're expected to go to college to have certain credentials to do X, Y, and Z, and if more and more people go, oh, actually people can go on YouTube and gain those abilities, then colleges they'll lose that monopoly status, social monopoly at least, and prices will come down. Because prices tend to be up where there's a monopoly and there's inefficiencies. And I think that could start to free people from the debt problem that you see in the West and different things. So maybe we can think of the liminal web as fighting, helping bring down the cost of college to start getting out of these debt things. So, on different things like that.
Let's hope.
Yeah, absolutely. But an example, I will say, I can't resist an opportunity to read a little bit. So Paperweight by Mr. Pae Veo, on the example of how a work that has ideas can inspire dialogue, where Pae Veo starts the piece. For a moment or another, altogether unexpected, you forget the value of the essay you have spent hours reading because you started to hum a familiar melody that placed you in a field with kids who went by the names of the lost boys who lost their lives in Neverland. You were waiting for a train. You still have the railway spike you used that day, but these days you use it as a paperweight. And that would be some of the opening of the Stygian collection. And so
I think he's looking for his paperweight.
Oh, he's looking for his paperweight. Do we get to see it?
I think so.
Oh, I think he's going to find his paperweight.
That's what I'm assuming is happening here.
Oh, that is so
it is
great.
nearby.
Oh my gosh, we're gonna get to see it. Oh, ladies and gentlemen, we have a Stygian exclusive.
There you go.
Bam, there it is, the Paperweight.
This is what I had on my desk when I was writing that.
You literally
this is a
did
very old thing that I picked up off the rails when I was hopping trains.
Oh my gosh. So the internet knows that Pae hop trains because he's a hero of the people. So he's a hobo. Well, that's amazing. So you literally have an actual Paperweight railroad. So let me ask you. So the thing I was going to say, first off, there were two. So I'll do two questions. First off, I find it in a lot of your work, Pae, that there's a role of memory. Memory seems to be an important theme. How the mind brings forth memory, how the mind interprets situations, how it frames phenomenon and different things. And why is that? What is it about memory that you find so interesting that you like to incorporate into your story? And then the second thing would be, was it the seeing of the nail on your desk that inspired the story, that then everything came out of it? What brought it about in its origins? But you can take either of those questions however you like. But I'm always fascinated by the role of memory in your work, Pae.
Yeah, I forget. No, yeah, there's well, with this particular story, actually, it's kind of funny how this was actually written for a video I did a while ago, and anyone could hear. I did I have it read. It's a bit of a different version because I rewrote it since, but hear me read it on my channel where I kind of act it all out. But so it was written for that in the span of about 30 minutes or so. I don't. And yeah, I really don't remember much about writing this particular piece. I mean, I know what it's about. I was just describing this as it was actually kind of this self-reflective kind of talking about the moment of me remembering another moment, I guess. And so that's really all it was. And that piece, I'm not really. I know if the last novel I put out was very focused on memory, and this was primarily due to its philosophical implications, and of course, this little novel is just a story of a young girl trying to find the meaning behind these mundane rocks, in which she comes across in her apartment after waking up from the hospital and having no clue why they're there. And really, it was just an excuse to kind of tell this story of the history of existential thought. And so it goes beginning kind of, you can see where Kierkegaard kind of his ideas are being presented and trying to figure it in, all the way to more post-war existentialists. But so that's why I used it in there. And I don't know, with the story that you just read from, I think, and I have another novel in which kind of tells the story of what I'm remembering in that little piece that you just read. And it's I guess I mean it was a long experience in a time in my life, and so and I have no other way of explaining but remembering it, I guess. So it's I mean, I know that's a very simple kind of answer, but that I mean, that would be the reason why. I mean, it's just a kind of a true story that I mean, true in the sense of fiction, right? That's kind of telling of that. But yeah, I guess I mean, yeah, I guess it's I don't know if that's the answer that you were looking for or expecting, but it was really just in some senses it was just a very easy way to because especially with that novel that I recently put out, it was meant to be kind of a children's book for existentialists. Like it's a kid's book, or essentially, but tackling very more adult concepts, I guess, in philosophy. So which was just kind of a funny idea I had one day when at university. It was also written about 12 years ago now, and so when I was at university taking these courses, and I just wrote it in a couple weeks when I was sitting in class, and then just thought it would be funny to publish it, really. But yeah, I was also reading a lot of Kafka. Well, I'm always reading a lot of Kafka, but what's that joke? I used to read a lot of Kafka. I still read a lot of Kafka, but I used to do it too. And there's so that whole concept of this finding the meaning behind rocks, and not necessarily meaning, but why, not really meaning behind the rocks, but why they're there is the rocks are actually quite irrelevant. It's you know, the question, you know, many philosophers, first one comes to mind, Heidegger's in Introduction to Metaphysics begins, you know, why is there existence rather than non-existence, is essentially the question. But in this case it's rocks. But of course I just had to have the character not remember why they're there, because that would ruin the whole thing if it was found out on the next page. So I kind of had to play with it in that sense. But
well, first off,
yeah.
That's actually the exact answer that I wanted. I wrote it out ahead of time, and I was reading it as you spoke, and you actually did give the exact answer. So I really appreciate that. It was actually
you know him way too well.
To the period, right there, commas and everything. It was really well done. So thank you. I really appreciate that. Second, I'm glad in the Pérelin Decline, the next one wasn't, oh, it's because she shopped at Home Depot that morning. Oh, that's why I have the rocks. And then that was the end. So I'm glad that wasn't what occurred. And also, it's really hot that it's the history of existential philosophy. And I'm glad, and yeah, I'm glad you framed it as a kid's book for that, because I gave it to Grace. So it's perfect. I was thinking that was awkward. It's like C6. She should know about this. I mean, Syphilis is coming, so it all works out. The other thing too, but please, Holly.
I was just gonna say, and the model for the cover was my my dad's upstairs neighbor, who's like my dad's upstairs neighbor's daughter. So
oh, that's lovely.
Have a kid on the front too. Yeah.
Yeah.
And she got a copy of the book. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Well that is lovely. And I meant to know you were speaking about your parents being creative. I think that's wonderful as well. That's kind of been in the air for your entire life. I think that's a wonderful thing. And yeah, the other thing, you know, I love how you were describing like memory and remembering and all of these type of things. And isn't it kind of interesting? I find it interesting that paying attention to memory in its very unfolding, or trying to remember, forgetting, remembering, that almost creates a story in the act of just trying to describe that. And that's very interesting to me, which kind of hints at there's something about the human being that is in its unfolding story. That there's something about, if you just pay attention to how thinking works, it has this way of forming a story. Not just a data point. It like unfolds like a story.
No, absolutely. And this could take the starting understanding of the transcendental ego, in which, you know, whenever you will look back on yourself, the I shows itself. Whenever you think back on yourself, the ego is something that exists in kind of a narrative form, and so in such a sense, every story ever told will have the aspect of memory within it.
Oh, absolutely. And I think if it is true that there is something about the unfolding of thought, which then, of course, the thought that you had a minute ago is now a memory, right? So it's always falling back into memory. And then we look at classical thought like Augustine, where memory was so primary, and Bergson and different things. Like, it just makes me think, if there is something about thought that has some sort of movement in the direction of story, then if we don't teach story, or we only teach thought as equations and syllogisms, then we may not have in the content of thought something that can help us understand the form of thought. And maybe that makes us poor at formulating it, which would be an unintentional consequence of not teaching the humanities, right? Because you're not trained in thinking story, and therefore you actually can't even think according to thought. And I should note, it's interesting because of what I hear in you speaking. So first off, the title Paperweight, it's funny to think that, like, once you look at paper, and you have a memory about that paper, it's given a weight that's not in the paper, but it has a weight because of your memory, right? So, and it's funny how every paper that's written on, that's then given the memory of the idea that's put on it, then gains a kind of weight that is more than just the weight of the paper itself, and however many ounces that might be.
That metaphor was definitely there when I was writing it.
Beautiful. I think
it wasn't. No, I love that. I didn't think of that, but you know, I love that. That's fantastic.
But you didn't. No, you did think of it, but you forgot. So now it's there. So it's just coming back. So, you know, that's part of it. But to see the Paperweight, and the last thing I'll say, is I personally, the thing that kind of blew my mind one day, I was reading Redwall, because I love the Redwall series.
Oh, yeah.
And I love those.
Forgot about that.
Oh,
those
yeah,
were so good.
Yeah, I think it was Malfox. Was it Malfox or Mayfox? It's like book 4 or something. And I would read Martin the Warrior. That was the one. And the way I would do this is getting a big blanket, putting it in a bathtub, and reading it in the bathtub with a blanket, because you make it like a giant like bed thing. And I was reading the book.
It's like the land of counterpain.
Is that what it is?
I brought this. Have you? Sorry, I just have to say, because I was mentioning this to Pae, and I don't know if anyone even knows. It's by Robert Louis Stevenson. And I love him. As a sick kid, there was, I think it was a poem. Yeah, it was a poem about being sick in bed and creating an entire world on the land of counterpain, where you're imagining this city and everything, like in your bedding, as there's like mountains being created by your knees under the covers and stuff like that.
Well, that's amazing, because that's what the bathtub was at like 11 at night or whatever, whatever. And one day I was reading Martin the Warrior, and suddenly it occurred to me, there's a movie in my head. I am literally seeing a mouse with a sword while looking at words on a piece of paper. How is that possible? And it kind of freaked me out, actually. It was this moment where I was like, wait. Where am I when I'm reading this book? Like, where am I? And that and one day realizing I couldn't look at my own face, those were two like really radical moments that launched me into philosophy. Like, thinking that way, it's like, how is it that you can be here but also there in the movie playing in your head at the same time? Like, how does that work? And it's like, to me, really wondering and paying attention to that like opens so much. And it's interesting how if you really just pay attention to memory and how memory works, it kind of opens so much. And I do also think that kind of attention, maybe Simone Weil, that like that kind of noticing is part of what makes life unfold, and how the humanities and the arts and stories can kind of train that thing.
When you ask the question, where am I? Because what you said as well, that you go back to that I, where is that I, and then suddenly at that young age where you started reading that, you didn't even realize you were having this very Cartesian crisis that started to develop. I imagine that's exactly where Descartes was coming from, sitting by the fire, melting wax.
I like to think that wherever you were, you felt a bing in the sky, and you're like, there's some guy in Virginia in a bathtub right now having a Cartesian moment. I like to think that you felt that wherever you may have been, Pae. You were like, someone right now is having a moment. So brings me great comfort.
That's my superpower. I'd like
to see Cartesian moment.
Marvel needs to develop that superhero.
Well, I think it doesn't. I think like Professor X sort of gets a vibe like when there's a new X-Men,
like Spider-Man and X-Men.
Yeah,
yes,
so Pae can tell whenever a new philosopher is being born.
Cartesianism. It's like Spidey sense. Different thing. No, and the other, like, actually, now I'm going down memory. The other thing is one, I don't know what, well, actually, this would be really Cartesian. And it's where the paper Thinking and Perception, which was kind of the birth of the reconstructing A, because I'd been thinking about the A is A problem for 12 years and was trying to like, but then it was like, I looked at my hand one day and realized, wait a minute, if I stop thinking about my hand, it doesn't go away. And actually what's there is different from the thought of it until I think about it, and now it's consumed with the thought. And it's like reality is always 1 second from being consumed by an idea that then makes it seem like it's just the idea. And how do you even like, it's like, oh, what the brain does is not merely think. It also like perceives. And, you know, at the time it was like, oh, there's this weird way in which the brain thinks about what it does as always thinking. But there's actually multiple activities that are going on that if you think about it, it just makes it seem like all the brain does is think. But there's something more. And then I guess I, in my head, linked that with reading like a book and having a movie playing in your head. Because it's like, oh, the brain's also able to like world. It doesn't just like think ideas, it like worlds. It puts you in worlds. And it doesn't merely give you data points. And then it's like, well, how much of what we think is just thinking data when we live our daily lives is more like worlding, like what happens when you read a book, than we realize. Because often we think when we think all we're doing is data collecting or data claiming or whatever. But really it's more worlding. And again, that's one of the reasons why I think if philosophy and thinking loses story, then it actually results in thinking not even knowing what it does. Like thinking doesn't know what it does without the humanities and story. It doesn't realize what it does. And so then it can't think what it does. And so then it doesn't think it's missing anything. That's the problem. Like if thinking can't think what it does, then it can't think what it lacks, and therefore it's lacking nothing. And so we devolve into something that we can't even know we've devolved into because we've lost the standard to tell that something was lost. And that's another thing why I think the humanities is so important, is because if you lose what the humanities give you, you also lose the capacity to tell that you lost that thing that the humanities could give you. And so it becomes a total loss. All the more reason why literature and philosophy should be in conversation with one another so that they both don't lose something in the same act that they lose the capacity to tell that they lost something.
I think that's brilliantly said.
Well, that's kind of you, Holly. And I will throw a question at you, because the graveyard thoughts that I'd love to see, and I appreciate good poetry, and I appreciate a well-designed and elegant use of language. So and I find in these conversations this tension between ruining story and reading too much or too little. So forgive me for that, but I can't resist. I don't think I'm giving too much away, but there's this section here because you also have a lovely work on Dante, which sings to me because Dante is like my boy. Wallace Stevens, like if you like Wallace Stevens and Dante, like I was mentioning this with Cleo. I really know, like, I keep going through the Commedia. This might be a crazy hot take, but now I want to like read the Commedia as a movement from algebra to geometry, because in the Inferno, it's all points. And as you move toward the Paradiso, it's more circles and like situations. And it's actually interesting to think that it's a gaining of intelligibility according from point to geometry. And of course, as Pae knows, I have this Leibniz obsession, and I actually do see it there, probably because I want to see it there. But, you know, I really am good at seeing it there, and I'm really good with my hallucinations. But there's a movement in Dante that feels like algebra to geometry. And so
I can see Pae is 100% agreeing with you here.
I love you. I love you.
I want to hear more about that now. That sounds. Yeah, no,
I see the expression of like, oh.
No, I'm very so Stygian's even good because we have that with Dante, so I always appreciate it. And but in that the other work I actually, funny enough, I'll tell a quick little note. I took a class with the great Kevin Hart, who's a tremendous poet and thinker, and he's a great man, a theologian and philosopher, and he did a class on Wallace Stevens. And I really didn't know who Wallace Stevens was, and now I adore Wallace Stevens. But anyway, you know, Wallace Stevens was one of the last moderns that did long poems, like these kind of long works. The one I really like was Notes to a Supreme Fiction, and I started a paper on it, and it got to 90 single space pages, and it was only supposed to be 20, double. And I turned in this incomplete work to Dr. Hart. And I'm like, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I've always wanted to go back to that, like, you know, on Wallace Stevens. Anyway, from your set, you guys are great. So you're just great. So unexpected it comes, and I wait only for the inevitability of its passing. My hands travel to my pulse, and my mind travels to faraway countries, countries where my blood lives still, mixed with bullet casings. Do poets sit in the trench, as I do by the graves? There's something to be said about the futility of an artist without a war, but ours are incomparable. Could go from there. So, Holly, what's the difference between a poet that is in the trenches or by the trench or sit in the trench and one by the graves? Do they both go together? And what does a poet or an artist lose when they don't have a war?
So this is kind of a big discussion, which might be a little bit offensive to some of my friends, so I won't. I'll
Those
say
are
what
the
I can.
best. Those are the best.
I mean, hopefully not, but I was thinking about a lot of things. So with my poetry, I always like when anyone says that it's good or it's thought out or anything, I think that's a huge compliment because all of my poetry, I just write it. Like I sit down and it happens. So like every poem I write comes out in like 15 minutes or something like that. And if it doesn't, it's not gonna go anywhere. So Graveyard Thoughts, I had actually been invited by a friend to do my first like reading on stage out loud, and I was kind of terrified, and I knew that I needed new stuff because I had a lot of things I'd been sort of working on for years, and there were stories and like lots of longer things. I don't write a lot of short stuff. I didn't have like shorter stories, so I was like, I need something. So I was trying to like pull on all my inspiration, and I went to, just to set the tone here, I went to the graveyard because I love the graveyard and it makes me feel things. My mom took me walking there when I was little. Like that was where we went when I was little. We didn't go to the park. We went to walk through the graveyard. And so I went there. We have an amazing graveyard in Montreal. It like fills an entire mountain. I think it's like the biggest graveyard in North America. And I thought, well, something's going to happen. And I had like a water bottle of wine I mentioned in here, I think. And I was just sitting in the graveyard with my notebook, and I was drinking some wine. And so I guess like the initial things I was thinking, so my heritage is Ukrainian and Polish. And things were going on with Ukraine when I was writing this. This was just sort of a news thing, and I had done like a photo shoot that was trying to show some more traditional stuff because I haven't been able to explore my heritage a lot. And my granny came from Ukraine, so I'm like second, third generation. I don't know. I always get mixed up. And she was one of those people who came here and was just like, we're going to drop everything about our history. Like we are not going to keep the language. She kept the food, thankfully, so I can make pierogies and the food is great. But I was kind of feeling that loss because I had always thought somehow that, well, you know, maybe I'll get there and I'll be able to explore some of that heritage and that history that I never got to learn through my family because they were so focused on assimilating. And then with everything that was going on, I thought I might actually not ever get there in the way that I want to. And then another thought that was playing here was that there were a lot of artists. I think I had just recently watched the film about Tolkien and war and how that inspired him. And I think there were a lot of amazing writers specifically who went to war and came back with these sort of allegorical things and archetypes and all of that they had born from these huge horrible events, like these very human events. So I was thinking about that. And then I was also thinking about how we haven't had anything like that in so long, and I think that's a good thing. But at the same time, there's this interesting topic of generations right now focusing on a lot of stuff that doesn't matter, which goes back to, you know, art for art's sake and why we've been focusing on this press, that I think that there's this sort of obsession over things that are not human, that are very selfish and not the way we should be thinking, things that are toxic and bad for you, to just get wrapped up in these thoughts. And I've heard some people say, oh, you know what this generation needs is a war, which I wouldn't agree with. But, you know, meditating on that concept of, there is that element of a generation going through something so horrible that it puts their life into perspective in a way that we just don't have right now. So that's everything that was going through my mind there with art and war and my history.
Well, that's a magnificent answer. You said a lot of really important things. So there's a few things that come to mind. First, I think that decision of, do you assimilate, do you leave something entirely behind, and where it seems wise to do it, but then there's a loss to it and all these different things. It's interesting because as you were speaking, makes me think of how actually a lot of, I wonder if we could say that's almost like the choice that a lot of people make who feel like they should be a writer or an artist. Like they say, no, I'm not going to be professional, but I'm going to leave it all behind. I'm not going to talk. I'm just going to assimilate to the system. I'm just going to assimilate to business and different things. And there seems to be a high cost to that. And it also seems to be a high cost to a society that encourages that. Now, I know this would get into different policies of, okay, are you saying everyone should speak different languages and all of the difficult with that? I will say this, if you want a society, there is a challenge to diversity and difference that I'm not sure if we're really ready for because we haven't done the work for it. Difference is hard. We like to talk about difference, but we actually don't like to encounter real difference. Like we like to talk about the arts, but then when you find someone who's actually an artist, they're crazy. We like to talk about pursuing their passions, but when you find someone that's really pursuing their passions, you don't like it. We like to talk about, the importance of a multitude of voices, but then when you find someone has a different view of a certain social issue, you never want to talk to them again, and they're the Antichrist, right? And so to me, one of the great challenges we need to have is actually to be people who prove ourselves able to be around difference, to communicate with it, to speak it, and to accept it in a manner that actually brings out the difference. But I actually think that requires facing the dark things, the difficulty, because usually when you face difference, you go into yourself and think about yourself. Like, I could be different. Why am I not different? Oh, it looks like the world is bigger than my take on it. Well, suddenly you're open to a war happening in Europe. Suddenly you're open to all the histories that people have come through. So there's something about, like, if we're going to have a culture like we talked at the beginning, where there's this emphasis on diversity and different identities and different things, for me, that's actually very much aligned with this need to encounter darkness. We actually can't do diversity unless we're able to handle darkness, because diversity forces us to reflect on ourselves, go into ourselves, and that's hard. And we don't like that. And we tend to then recoil violently against the people who made us do that, and then diversity turns into tribalism, atomization, and all of these different things. The thought you also said, I was very, my grandfather, who I basically grew up with sitting on his porch, was in World War II, and he would always tell about the stories on the ships or the violence or the different things. And I didn't realize it at the time, but as you get older, you realize, you go, oh, wait, a lot of people didn't grow up with that. And that's not in the back of their mind. And one of the great ironies, and it's this really weird thing, it's almost like people want to avoid, it's almost like if you avoid the darkness, you end up in this bad nihilism. It's this weird irony where, like, what's happened today, people, like you said, people don't know what matters, right? One of the reasons they don't know what matters is because they haven't encountered the dark or the war or the violent. And so
like
it's really
real darkness.
The real darkness. And so there's an irony where it's like people avoid the dark things and then end up in a nihilism, like this bad nihilism that Nietzsche say. It's almost like people would associate darkness with ending up in nihilism, but actually it can be the complete reverse. We're going, oh my gosh, the world is a place where war can happen. People can do this to one another. So what do I value? And does that actually matter at the end of the day? And, I was very lucky. You mentioned a graveyard. My grandfather there was a little plot on the farm that my grandfather was like, yeah, someone's buried there. You're like, really? So there's like this body that's on the farm in your kind of mist, someone who died quite young. And it's like, oh, there's death here. And then, Michelle, we've talked before, when you're on a farm and you have animals that are just breaking a leg in a ditch, or they're dying, or coyotes come, and you're encountering with this violence and this blood. It's counterintuitive, but I think you put your finger on the exact truth, Holly. Encounters with that actually makes you less nihilistic. it makes you more actually aware of what matters. And I think in the culture today, it's kind of funny because it's like when everything is clean and neat and nice, then you actually, it's like niceness leads to nihilism.
Then your brain starts eating itself alive.
Yes.
I've always said, even just, and this is a much sort of lighter thing, but I mean, I'm in the goth subculture ever since I was in high school. I have death stuff all around me. We've got like brain art, and I surround myself by that. I consider myself in they call it death positive community, which was coined by Caitlin, I forget her last name. She's the mortician on YouTube, and it's just sort of facing these things. And a lot of people will look at people who do that and say, like, oh, that's really concerning. Why do you want to look at that? That's dark. It's like, well, no, I think it's important to face death regularly. Otherwise, how are you going to properly appreciate life?
Well, it makes me think, is it The Eternal Husband, where they, in Dostoevsky, where they have the body on the table, and that was a Russian tendency, when a body died, you'd leave it on a table for 3 days because it was believed that the spirit didn't leave until the third day and it had to circle, and so the body would be right there. I mean, the other thing that
you had Irish wakes like that too.
Yeah, that's correct.
Dance around with the body.
Oh yeah, and then like also too, like people, they send someone to the hospital to die, and I'm not trying to bash the medical system or anything, but there's a certain sort of like push that away. And one of the things that Ivan Illich talks about that I think is very true, he's basically like, we don't know how to die. We've lost the art of dying. Death is not noble. It's not a way. It's not kind of artful. And he says with that, what ends up happening is death becomes, it's not a part of life then, really. It's something that's alien. But of course, if someone like Heidegger, who's emphasizing being toward death, if there's something about death, and the religions seem to know this, isn't it? It's people forget, like if I think Christianity, like you literally forget that cross, you know what that is? Like this is an incredibly violent, like it's almost like you need Christians to realize what they're talking about is to wear an electric chair. Like that's what they forget. Like you're in essence wearing an electric chair. And how so much of like so many of religion, not just Christianity is just an example that comes to mind, where death is central. And one of the things actually with the death of God after Nietzsche and the decline of religion and all of those things, something that then culture has to be intentional about, that religions could perhaps help people with, is actually regular encounters of death ritual, of death experience, of blood, of thinking of crucifixion, of thinking about death. And if you don't have your religion that you're just growing up part of, now, of course, religions come with their own problems, but everything comes with trade-offs. If you don't have a regular cultural habit or ritual of making you look at something that's an execution device or thinking about death, even in Judaism, Islam, there's all of these stories that are violent. And we can go on the Mahabharata. I mean, there's all of these long narratives of conflict and war, and how even the gods are part of war in some instances, are interested in that. If you don't have that reminder, then what ends up happening is if you believe in God, it's an abstract entity that has nothing to do with death and war, as opposed to part of a narrative structure where that's included. And then you don't have any encounter with it. So then you're scared of it, right? Basically, you're scared of anything that's dark. And then ironically, this is the great irony, when you're scared to death of the dark, you end up a nihilist. That's what's so strange, is when you're scared of the dark, you end up a nihilist.
And I think that's something that also goes back to the discussion about the humanities and university and how that's changed, is we don't respect old knowledge or elders anymore. And that's another thing which is probably why, things like philosophy are being pushed out of fiction and stuff, because there's so much worship of youth. And there isn't that respect that our society used to have for elders and dying and that sort of end of life phase and all the knowledge that comes along with that.
I was having the pleasure of speaking with Layman Pascal, and Bruce Alderman does this as well, and Cleo was mentioning this, where we don't have eldership, we have retirement. And eldership, for Bruce Alderman, that he emphasizes, is the ability to occupy time. It's a certain indwelling and inhabitance of time, where life is then given a special quality, a certain way of being in time. And there are some Eastern traditions that are a little better of this. But in all, like, again, there's Kairos time in Western notions. There's this idea that there's a way to live that makes it possible to access a different quality of time, to dwell in time differently. And I think the loss of eldership is tied to the loss of the humanities, because the humanities, if the humanities can teach you to have a kind of dialogue and friendship and relation that has a unique kind of quality, I do think and suppose that that quality is actually the very same quality of eldership. The ability to actually then dwell in it and to see how it's central to the community. And so literature and philosophy are tied to the death of eldership.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you mentioned Heidegger a bit ago, and that removal from the they, and this is how we typically look at death. It is something that happens today, and when you and this is why he's often quoted with that people should spend more time in graveyards. And I think it's very, very beneficial, as Holly, you're saying, it's you're being forced to be in such a situation does help, right? Because this is you're not of course experiencing death, you're experiencing the awareness, which and as writing about it would kind of be this constant understanding of that removal from the they. But what's funny, I was also going to mention, I was going to make the same point that you made when you were discussing Dostoevsky, except I was going to use a different scene, because he tackles this frequently throughout his writing. I was just going to say another great example of what you're saying, if you want to continue to use Dostoevsky, was the scene from The Idiot, when they're looking at the painting of the dead Christ rotting on the, and suddenly in a moment, he understands what atheism is, and thinking, well, this is a person. This is actually what happens, kind of, and how disgusting he thought it was to represent something real, is what it was the painting was depicting. It's just a similar point, but just a different. I was going to say the same thing, just with a different scene from Dostoevsky. I just thought it was kind of funny.
I think to bring up that painting in the same novel that tells us beauty will save the world is also quite interesting, because it would also suggest the only way to get a real understanding of beauty, it requires looking at that painting. It makes me think of, I sometimes wonder that one of the great problem with Christianity, which I just have history with, is they talk about Good Friday, they talk about Easter, they don't talk about Holy Saturday. Holy Saturday is a fascinating day. God is dead, and he's dead. He's dead. There's nothing happening today. He's just dead. He's that painting, right? You could say descend into hell. Some people say that's kind of wiped from the thinking, but that seems to have a really important role. Like God is a decomposing body, right? Like God is descending into hell, right? This is part, if you want resurrection, the only way that's possible is descend into hell, right? And it's really important when you look at the creeds, and it just makes me think of what Holly is saying. There's no resurrection before the descending into hell, which would actually suggest, just like in Dante, you can't get to the Paradiso because you have to go the way up through hell, right? And if you look, and this is kind of the irony that we're seeing, a society that removes darkness, ironically, removes a way to the Paradiso. It removes a way to life. And so then people don't get to life, and they end up in this nihilism. And by nihilism, that word means a lot of things to a lot of different people. I mean it more of the bad nihilism, which is the loss of the capacity to see significance. The reason, the ability to be a motivation, really, like why kind of thing.
I was just going to, I remember going off that point. Oh, geez, I just lost it. It was there.
But that's perfect. It goes with your story.
It was, yeah. It's just a continuation. This is the sequel.
This is the sequel. Zoom wait.
We're writing it together right now.
Oh my gosh, this is beautiful.
It's a collaborative work.
Oh, this is great. See what we can do, book 2.
You actually, yeah, it's in Belonging Again, actually, where you mention this well, when you say losing this darkness and losing this history, you're replacing these things with symbols, and when the symbol takes on say what was the example you used? I think it was the cross, when when it's represented as as say something beautiful, or it's used as this just for the focus is more and more of this aesthetic, you end up losing this history that at one point connected and made a community.
That's right.
And yeah, it just reminded me, I guess, of where you talk about this.
Well, I am always down for a belonging again reference, so thank you for that. That's really kind of you. You rock. And no, it makes me think, well, the problem is, like, early Christians looking at the cross,
It would have been a symbol of, like, don't be afraid, like, do what you're supposed to do. Like, the cross is no longer a symbol of courage. It's now just a beautiful, like, that's one of the problems also when you get this big emphasis on heaven. Well, then you don't have to be courageous because you're saved, right? And like one of the reasons why looking at dark, well, if you don't, I do think a society that doesn't look at darkness will be lacking in courage, actually. Because and Alex Ebert likes to say, and I like how he says, like, the meaning of life is courage, which I really like. And it would seem as if, and I think this is found in many old traditions, like, you can't have courage if you're not able to look at that painting of a decomposing Christ, right? Like, until you look at that painting, you actually don't believe in the death of God, right?
I have a funny little anecdote, just that you're referencing this decomposing Christ. When we're talking about my weird childhood moments, I have to say it because my mom will be upset if I don't. And she's definitely going to watch this. When I was little, I went to an art gallery, and I was probably about, I don't know, 6. And I was there with a friend, and he and I went running off, like, oh, we're going to go through the art gallery. It's going to be so exciting. And my mom was like, it's art gallery, let her go. And I ran into a room where it was a whole religious display. It was all religious art. And the big centerpiece was this massive painting of Jesus on the cross. Very, like, hyper realistic, brutal blood. I'm 6. I run in with my friend, and he and I both run up and just stop in front of it. And then we turn around and run out. And I run up to my mom and I say, Mommy, I saw something. And she and I bring that story back, like, yeah, that probably did something. I just thought, Mommy, I saw something. That was it. That's all I could say. I saw something.
I just love the image of Holly being like, Mommy, I saw something. It's like, Jesus? It's like,
Yeah. that was my come to Jesus moment.
That was like, was it? That's really funny. Well, first off, I should note that Pamela is delightful, and I really enjoyed working with her, and I thought her editing was magnificent, and it was wonderful to have exchanges with her as she worked through the story and brought out some of the details. So I appreciate Pamela very much.
Yes, she's been an excellent glue to have throughout this.
No, absolutely. And it's always nice to have there were some examples, not to go too much into it, where I feel like many editors would just say, oh, they'd like just assume the intention and change it accordingly, as opposed to ask and think, hey, I think you did this on purpose. Is that the case? Like, and actually, I can see the artistic merit of it. Like, there's a point in our story, Olive Leaves, where there's the play on the word altar and altar, like sacrifice, and it's intentionally kind of situated to have that double entendre in operation. I think most editors would not have picked up on that, and so that's just one example of the magnificence that she brought to the table. Well, I'm extremely tempted as we I really enjoyed this conversation as we come up on the close. I am tempted to read more lines, as will I, as I sit among the graves, knowing this, that this is not yet my home, while the flies traverse strands of my hair, the root formation of veins on my hand. With every step they whisper that I'll be there soon, but until then, I'll fight my war upon the paper. And if I were to ask you, in what ways do we hope to fight our war upon the paper moving forward? What are you hoping to continue to do with Stygian? What is maybe even the work that you're doing now? And then also just an open invitation to talk about what has it been like in the interviews with Stygian. I also will make a point, Holly, your marketing skills are unbelievable. It's really hard to market. It's really hard to come up with ideas and to have the business focus and marketing focus. that's really hard. And it's also really hard to find creatives who are able to do that. And so I salute you for that ability. So I salute you in that. And then just as an open question, what's the experience been like with the book being out, the interviews? What are you hoping for in the war upon the paper going forward? And that can be to both of you to answer in any way whatsoever. But this has really been a treat.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed this a lot too. And especially as I was saying before we started recording, I've done an interview this morning, and then I did a recording for a special project that I'm not announcing yet. And so this is my third thing today, and I've been very tired, but I have to say this conversation woke me up. So I've enjoyed it a lot. So yeah, I'll sort of answer this and then Pae can wrap it up. But the interviews to start, because I'm trying to remember every point you mentioned here. The interviews have been amazing. It's been like I knew that when we gathered this collection of authors together that we had a really special group, and we'd communicated to a certain degree, right? Like just through, group conversations and stuff like that. But doing the interviews has been a really great experience just to really connect with everyone one-on-one. And I think the timing has been perfect too, just after we have the project out and everyone's sort of sitting back and feeling like they've accomplished something. It's so nice to touch base that way. So I've enjoyed that a lot. And I think one of the coolest parts of that is just that every single interview has a very different angle, even though I'm asking very different questions. So if anyone hasn't watched the interview series yet, I highly recommend it. I think it's been really helpful. And if you're an author yourself, it's very helpful. It's very inspirational, I think. And yeah, so that's been great. I think that and with the reception of the book itself, it's been really good. It's been I mean, the whole process has been better than I personally expected, honestly. Like I thought it would be good, and I thought when Pae had the idea with the anthology, I was like, no, that's perfect. That is the perfect way to launch this. And I had hopes for it, but I think it's really exceeded those hopes, and it's become just such a special project. And moving forward, I do hope to keep fighting that war on paper of bringing back some old artistic sensibilities while there's never any element of not being inclusive, but we really want to focus on the talent, the story, the philosophy, and these things that we've lost as the world has gone on and as the internet has come into the mix of everything, because there are great positive elements of the internet, like we've discussed, how we can form these communities, but there are some negative elements as well. And I think that just trying to get back to some of the things we've lost, we have to start doing that. And I'm sure that we're not alone, and hopefully we start seeing more people and more presses doing the same thing.
Yeah, what do we have planned? Well, we've been doing readings around here. We might have gone to Toronto. We've done readings there. And in October 19th, we'll be heading to Alberta to do a reading there, and hopefully find a few other places maybe around that area to continue doing readings. We're actually going to be meeting up with another author that contributed to the anthology while there, Jolene, who Adventure Bookworm Adventure.
Bookworm Adventure Girl.
Bookworm Adventure Girl is her channel. So we have that planned. We've gotten quite a few submissions, which we will be looking over, and a few really interesting ones that I hope to bring up after September. But yeah, so it is continuing with publications. I know I have one myself that I'll probably be putting forward, not the novel I just talked about earlier, but a separate work that I think I might rewrite here very soon. But anyway, yeah, it's yeah. So I guess for now we're still continuing, or just could call it a little reading tour wherever we are welcome. So that's been going quite well.
Yeah, and I guess I should mention we're doing there were people who requested that we do another anthology, but it was very much something that we had planned as just, you know, getting things going. But because of the interest in that, we're looking to doing zines. So we have a call for submission for a zine right now, which will be, you know, a collection of short stories and art and stuff like that. So if anyone does want to submit, it's a lot more, you know, it's casual, but it's still a publication. So if anyone is interested in submitting, I can give you a link and stuff like that. And I'm going to be traveling, so I'm hoping to meet up with some Stygian authors on my travels.
Well, you are both impressive in the undertakings and the travel and all the readings that you're doing. And I think it goes to show you how this kind of work actually does create different communities and how you're going to places and that you're sharing. And it's a topic that I just think about a lot. You know, again, like that book, Lost Connections, some people say we're in a friend session. A lot of people like Robert Poland,
Putman, Bowling Alone, says how there's no social capital and people aren't meeting at the bowling alley anymore and people are alone. You know, they don't have these connections. And I think this is the kind of work that helps bring that back. Where it's also just always interesting to me when you have people that all work on stories and when they get together, they have something to talk about. If everyone's separate in their own career paths and they don't have any hobbies or create anything in free time, then when they get together, they ask, "What'd you do today?" "Oh, I went to work and watched Netflix." "Okay," and then we never talk again. Or there's just that tyranny of the small talk that seems to define culture today. And I think it's an unintentional consequence of a society that doesn't look at darkness or look at these subjects that call you beyond yourself, to look at something beyond your immediacy. And if you don't do that, then it's hard to have these things that people share, that they can have a basis for community and friendship and work. And I think this very conversation has been a lovely example of the possibility of having conversation and interaction of that quality, that I think this kind of work on BookTube in general and at Stygian is an example of bringing back that communal capital and bringing back those sort of social and friendship interactions. And I think that is extremely invaluable, in addition to creating an outlet and an opportunity for people to put forth their work. To me, it all just speaks, if you have a world of nihilism or empty or people caught up on frivolous things, then this kind of work can sort of show people an alternative. To be part of these kind of things. So I would encourage people to submit to Stygian, to be part of these kind of things and to do their own work and to not feel as if all they can do is submit to publications they may not hear back from for 6 months, because the horror, another unintentional consequence, if that's the only thing that people can submit to, then that actually feeds atomization and loneliness and not having, because you're just waiting for this voice. It's not a dialogue, it's not a conversation. And you were saying saving literary dialogue. Well, you can't have that so much in the traditional structure. It's just you send something and wait for someone to say yay or nay. The dialogue never gets going. And if it gets going, then it's because you get published, you do it, but then that's it, that one off. And maybe there's something there, but often the people who are publishing your work, you never hear from, and you never get a community with the other authors in that publication that you have. You never know them. You don't have these YouTube interviews. You don't have these different things. And so the other thing that's so neat about this is often when works are published or they're marketing, they have nothing to do with the authors. They're not part of the creative process of that. And that's also exciting in this new way to do publications, as in everyone gets to be part of also the distribution. Now, of course, you two are doing the lion's share of the work, but to have this kind of awareness and seeing how friends are doing that in ways that we can all be part of it is absolutely another example of that building of communities. And it makes the whole creative process feel a lot less abstract, a lot less unknown, a lot less distant, a lot less just some kind of voice that either says yay or nay and we never hear from again. And I think that kind of liveness, that aliveness in the process of creating and distributing and publishing is missing from the traditional structure. And we can see in this way of doing things that it can be reclaimed, that it can be re-implemented, and that it can be to the benefit of all. So thank you for doing it. And thank you for all the work you've done to make it possible. It's been a pleasure, and I've enjoyed this conversation immensely. So thank you, Holly, and thank you, Pae.
Well, thank you for being involved. I have definitely enjoyed this conversation. It's been great.
I have as well. And thank you so much, Pae, for being here as well. And I appreciate you both. And Holly, to do 3 interviews in one day is ridiculously impressive. So well done. I'm amazed
what I
you're
do.
running. You well done. And like I said, it's been a pleasure. So thank you, Pae, as well, for everything that you've done.
No, thank you for having us. I think this is great.
It's been a pleasure. So well done to you both. We'll provide links and we will send everyone your way. And thank you so much for this opportunity. All the best to you.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.